Many people completely misunderstand this stage, and because of that misunderstanding, they respond in ways that often make the situation even harder. When someone with avoidant attachment begins creating distance, just as the relationship starts becoming emotionally meaningful, the first assumption is almost always the same. People immediately believe it means they have lost interest, are rejecting the relationship, or are intentionally playing emotional games. But what is happening beneath the surface is usually much more complicated. In many cases, you are not seeing a lack of feelings. You are seeing fear becoming active. An avoidant person usually has little difficulty with casual conversations or lighthearted relationships. Surface-level interactions feel safe because they do not require deep emotional exposure. They allow them to enjoy someone's company while still keeping control, protecting their independence, and maintaining emotional space. Everything feels manageable while the relationship remains light. But as the bond slowly grows stronger, something begins changing inside them. Conversations become more personal. Emotional trust starts developing. The relationship begins carrying real importance. Suddenly, this is no longer just another connection. It begins to matter. And that is often when their protective instincts become stronger. Instead of simply enjoying someone's presence, they now face the possibility of being truly understood. They risk allowing another person to see the parts of themselves they have spent years protecting. For someone who learned to survive by relying almost entirely on themselves, that level of vulnerability can feel deeply uncomfortable. Rather than moving closer, they often respond by creating distance. Sometimes the change is obvious. Other times it happens so gradually that you barely notice it at first. Their messages become less frequent. Their emotional warmth fades. They stop sharing as openly. They become unusually busy or seem consumed by other responsibilities. Some even begin convincing themselves that something about the relationship suddenly feels wrong. None of these reactions happen by accident. They are protective strategies designed to reduce the emotional discomfort that closeness creates. Stay with me, because the next part explains why this behavior often means the exact opposite of what people assume. Here is the contradiction that confuses so many people. The stronger the emotional connection becomes, the stronger the urge to step back can also become. From the outside, that seems completely irrational. Someone finally begins opening up, starts becoming emotionally available, and then unexpectedly pulls away. But when you understand the psychology behind it, the pattern becomes much easier to recognize. For many avoidant people, emotional closeness has become linked with emotional danger. The very experience they quietly long for is also connected to memories of overwhelm, rejection, loss of control, or emotional dependence. So the moment the relationship begins matching their deeper emotional needs, fear interrupts the process. Think about what that really means. If someone has spent years building emotional independence as a way of protecting themselves, intimacy does not simply feel unfamiliar. It challenges the entire system they created to stay emotionally safe. It asks them to lower defenses they have trusted for years. Naturally, that creates internal tension. Different people respond to emotional tension in different ways. Some move closer and seek reassurance. Others need temporary space. The avoidant response is often to create distance. That does not mean emotionally unavailable behavior should be excused, and it certainly does not mean inconsistency becomes healthy. It simply means you stop viewing every moment of withdrawal as proof that you are not enough. When fear is mistaken for indifference, people often become reactive. They chase explanations. They overthink every message. They work harder to prove their value. Ironically, those reactions frequently increase the avoidant person's urge to withdraw even more because the pressure feels overwhelming. What is needed instead is awareness. You begin recognizing that emotional distance is not always evidence that the relationship lacked meaning. Very often, It is evidence that the relationship carried enough emotional importance to activate protective habits that have existed for years. Once you begin seeing the pattern beneath the behavior, your perspective starts changing. You stop taking every shift in mood or every period of silence as a personal rejection. Instead, you recognize that much of the behavior reflects an internal fear response rather than your personal worth. People rarely run away from something that means nothing to them. More often, they step back from experiences that have the power to affect them deeply. For an avoidant person, intense emotional connection can feel dangerously close to losing control, so they retreat not because they feel nothing, but because they have not yet learned how to stay emotionally present without becoming overwhelmed. That naturally leads to an important question. Are you reacting emotionally to what they are doing, or are you understanding what is happening psychologically? Your answer shapes everything that follows. It determines whether you become trapped inside the same emotional cycle or remain grounded in your own stability. At that point, the focus is no longer only on their behavior. It also becomes about your ability to stay emotionally balanced without abandoning yourself in the process. Once you understand that their distance is often driven by fear instead of a lack of care, you stop depending on constant reassurance from them and begin creating emotional security within yourself. That shift changes the entire dynamic. But after you understand why they withdraw, another confusing pattern usually appears. Now you are no longer dealing only with distance, you are dealing with inconsistency. One day they seem warm, engaged, emotionally available, and fully invested. The next day they appear distracted, detached, unreachable, or emotionally absent. Without understanding the psychology behind these shifts, the experience can become emotionally exhausting. Yet these mixed signals are rarely random. They are often the visible expression of an internal conflict. One part of them genuinely wants closeness, intimacy, understanding, and the comfort of being deeply known by someone important. That desire is completely real. At the very same time, another part fears everything that emotional closeness represents. Intimacy may unconsciously feel connected to dependence, loss of freedom, emotional exposure, or pressure. These two opposing forces exist together, pulling them in different directions, which is exactly why their behavior can seem so unpredictable from the outside. And what happens next explains why this push and pull pattern continues until those deeper fears are finally addressed. They move closer when emotional connection feels safe. They step back when that same closeness begins feeling overwhelming. Their desire pulls them toward intimacy, while their fear pushes them away from it. Because these two forces are happening inside them at the same time, often without them fully understanding why, their behavior on the outside can seem confusing and unpredictable. From their perspective, they are simply protecting themselves. From your perspective, it feels like mixed signals that are impossible to understand. What makes this inconsistency so emotionally powerful is that people naturally seek stability and certainty. When someone behaves consistently, your mind relaxes because you know where you stand. But when their behavior constantly changes, your mind keeps searching for answers. You replay conversations. You analyze every message. You question your own actions. Little by little, you become emotionally attached to the uncertainty itself. You keep waiting for the warm, emotionally available version of them to return because you have already experienced those moments before. Those brief periods of closeness become incredibly powerful. They provide just enough emotional reward to keep your hope alive, but not enough consistency to create genuine security. That is why mixed signals can become emotionally exhausting. They keep you emotionally invested without giving you the stability you truly need. But it is important to understand what is actually happening. You are not dealing with someone who feels emotionally stable, but chooses to act inconsistently. More often, you are seeing someone who is internally divided between wanting closeness and fearing it at the exact same time. Stay with me, because this distinction changes the entire way you understand the relationship. When you respond by trying even harder to create consistency, you often strengthen the unhealthy pattern without realizing it. The more energy you invest trying to stabilize the relationship, the less responsibility they feel to face their own emotional habits. That is why the goal is not to decode every change in their behavior. The real goal is to recognize what those changes are telling you. Inconsistency usually reveals emotional conflict, and when someone is emotionally divided within themselves, they cannot consistently provide the safety and stability that a healthy relationship requires, no matter how sincere certain moments may seem. That does not automatically make them uncaring or intentionally hurtful. It simply means they are not emotionally ready to maintain the level of connection they genuinely want. This is where your own emotional clarity becomes essential. Instead of negotiating for consistency through extra effort, you begin recognizing consistency as something that naturally comes from emotional readiness. You stop believing that enough patience, enough understanding, or enough sacrifice will eventually create stability if the other person has not yet developed it within themselves. Eventually, you begin asking a much healthier question. Are you connected to who they consistently show themselves to be, or are you emotionally attached to the version of them that only appears during rare moments of vulnerability? Those are two completely different realities. Once you see that difference clearly, much of their inconsistency loses its emotional hold over you. You stop being pulled into every emotional high and every emotional low. You stop confusing intense feelings with lasting emotional depth. Instead of constantly asking why they keep changing, you begin asking yourself what kind of relationship truly meets your emotional needs. That question shifts your entire perspective because genuine emotional clarity begins the moment you stop investing in confusion and start valuing consistency, openness, honesty, and mutual emotional presence instead. This next stage is often where people become the most confused because the behavior seems completely contradictory. It is not only that an avoidant person struggles with closeness, it is that immediately after moments of genuine emotional connection, they often begin creating distance. That sudden shift can feel deeply unsettling. You share an honest conversation together. There is openness. There is vulnerability. You both feel emotionally present. For a brief moment, it seems like the relationship has reached a new level. It feels calmer, stronger, and more secure than before. Then, almost without warning, everything changes. They become quieter. They stop expressing themselves as freely. Their emotional presence fades. Sometimes they disappear into emotional distance altogether, almost as though the very experience that brought the two of you closer somehow pushed them away at the same time. If you only look at this emotionally, it naturally feels painful. It can feel like rejection. It can feel like inconsistency. You may even begin wondering whether the closeness meant anything at all. But when you examine the pattern psychologically instead of personally, it starts making much more sense. For someone with avoidant attachment, intimacy does not only create connection, it also activates their nervous system. The emotional closeness may be genuine, but it also awakens deeper fears that exist beneath the surface. Openness creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates emotional exposure. And emotional exposure can unconsciously trigger fears of dependence, losing control, abandonment, or becoming emotionally overwhelmed. For someone who has spent years believing that emotional dependence eventually leads to pain, those feelings create an internal alarm almost immediately. As a result, the withdrawal that follows is often not manipulation. It is an attempt to regulate overwhelming emotions. Their mind instinctively tries to restore a sense of safety by creating distance. Think of it this way. They are capable of emotional closeness, but only within a range that still feels manageable. Once the relationship crosses into deeper emotional territory, their protective habits become active and pull them back toward what feels familiar and emotionally controlled. That often appears as silence, emotional distance, sudden independence, or withdrawal. The closeness itself was not fake. In many cases, it was actually one of the most sincere moments in the relationship. The difficulty is not that the connection lacked meaning. The difficulty is that it carried more emotional weight than they knew how to handle comfortably. When you fail to recognize that difference, you begin doubting experiences that were actually genuine. You replay conversations, search for mistakes, and wonder whether you caused the change. But the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Closeness awakens fear. Fear creates distance. Then the cycle repeats itself again and again. This is exactly where your own awareness becomes most important. When someone pulls away after intimacy, your natural instinct is usually to restore the connection immediately. You want to reach out, reassure them, rebuild the closeness, and return to the warmth you just experienced. But for an avoidant person, that immediate pursuit can feel overwhelming instead of comforting, because they are trying to create emotional space to calm themselves internally. Your movement toward them may unintentionally feel like pressure, and pressure often increases their desire to step back even further. Without either person intending to create this pattern, both people begin reinforcing it together. One person creates distance to feel emotionally safe. The other moves closer to feel emotionally secure. And without greater awareness from both sides, the same cycle continues repeating itself. This is exactly why emotional awareness matters so much. Once you understand that their distance is not always a reflection of how meaningful the relationship is, but often a response to how emotionally intense it has become, your reactions begin to change. You stop rushing to close every emotional gap the moment it appears. You stop feeling responsible for fixing every period of silence or uncertainty. Instead, you learn how to allow healthy space without losing your own emotional balance or sense of self. You begin recognizing that intimacy is not something they naturally maintain with ease. It is something their nervous system often struggles to hold on to for long periods without becoming overwhelmed. In many ways, emotional closeness leaves them feeling as though they need time to recover afterward. Once you truly understand that, everything starts looking different. That does not mean you excuse emotionally unhealthy behavior forever. It does not mean you ignore your own emotional needs or accept constant emotional distance as normal. It simply means you stop carrying responsibility for struggles that belong to them. You stop interpreting every retreat as evidence that you are not enough. You stop assuming every quiet moment reflects your value. Instead, you begin making decisions from a place of emotional stability rather than emotional fear. That shift changes not only how you see them, but also how you protect your own well-being. Stay with me, because this next idea explains why so many relationships become trapped in the same repeating cycle without either person fully understanding why. Healthy relationships are not built only on powerful emotional moments. They are built on the ability to remain emotionally connected without fear constantly interrupting the bond. If every period of closeness is followed by withdrawal, emotional stability slowly begins to disappear. The same cycle repeats again and again. Connection grows stronger, fear becomes activated, distance follows. Eventually, the relationship reconnects, only for the same pattern to begin all over again. Over time, this cycle does not strengthen the relationship. It gradually drains both people emotionally. That is why the most important question is not whether those intimate moments were sincere. In many situations, they absolutely were. The deeper question is whether those moments can grow into something steady, dependable, and emotionally sustainable over time. Real intimacy is not simply about reaching emotional depth for a few beautiful moments. It is about remaining emotionally present together without fear, repeatedly pulling one person away. Eventually, a difficult realization begins to surface. You stop measuring the relationship by isolated moments of closeness and start paying attention to the overall pattern instead. Someone being capable of connecting with you occasionally is not the same as consistently showing up emotionally. If closeness appears only in short bursts before disappearing once again, then what you are experiencing is not true stability. It is emotional inconsistency. Naturally, you begin asking yourself whether occasional connection is enough to build a healthy future. That question changes everything. Instead of focusing only on emotionally intense moments, you begin asking whether the relationship can remain emotionally steady over time. Because intimacy that repeatedly disappears is not something solid you can confidently build your life around. It becomes something you keep trying to recover instead of something you can safely depend on. Healthy love should not feel like an endless process of rebuilding what keeps slipping away. It should feel secure, dependable, and emotionally steady. As you continue noticing these repeated cycles of closeness and distance, another truth slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Even when an avoidant person genuinely cares about you, there may still be a part of them that remains emotionally out of reach. You can often sense it without anyone saying a word. There are moments that feel deeply real, yet at the same time, an invisible barrier still exists between the two of you. The relationship constantly feels almost complete, almost emotionally safe, almost fully understood, but never entirely. Many people assume this uncertainty means the relationship itself is weak. More often, it reflects emotional protection. Allowing another person complete emotional access requires exposing fears, insecurities, painful memories, and vulnerable parts of yourself that feel difficult to reveal. For someone with avoidant attachment, that level of openness can feel threatening. It is not always because they distrust you personally. More often, vulnerability has become linked with painful experiences from earlier in life, such as rejection, shame, emotional overwhelm, abandonment, or losing control. As a result, they naturally separate different parts of themselves. They comfortably share what feels emotionally safe while protecting the deepest parts underneath. Many times this happens automatically without conscious intention. Even so, you still feel that invisible boundary. You notice it in conversations that never fully reach emotional depth. You notice it in the emotional distance that remains even during affectionate moments. It is not that they are completely absent. It is that they are never fully available. That difference becomes increasingly important over time because many partners eventually begin trying to earn access to those hidden parts. They believe that if they become patient enough, supportive enough, loving enough, or understanding enough, complete openness will finally happen. But emotional openness cannot be earned through effort alone. The other person must willingly participate in that process. And willingness depends not only on desire, but also on emotional readiness. You cannot build a completely open relationship with someone who is only able to be emotionally available part of the time. No matter how meaningful certain moments feel, the relationship will always be limited by what remains protected beneath the surface. Slowly, that limitation begins changing you as well. You stop bringing up certain emotional needs. You lower your expectations. You become more careful with your own vulnerability. Little by little, you begin making yourself smaller to fit inside the emotional limits of the relationship. That is where the true emotional cost appears, because eventually neither person feels completely free to express themselves. So the deeper question is no longer whether they care. In many cases, they truly do. The real question becomes whether care without full openness can sustain the kind of relationship you genuinely want. Lasting intimacy is not built on carefully managed emotional access or partial honesty. It grows through the willingness to be fully seen, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. If someone repeatedly steps back whenever the relationship becomes emotionally secure, they may not actually be afraid of losing you. They may be afraid of fully allowing themselves to have the closeness they secretly want. When you step back and look at the entire pattern, everything begins making more sense. What you are witnessing is rarely random inconsistency or emotional distance by itself. More often, you are seeing an internal struggle between the natural human desire for connection and deeply learned fears about what closeness represents. Many avoidant people are not emotionally empty. They often care deeply, connect sincerely, and experience genuine moments of intimacy. But alongside those feelings exists another powerful system shaped by years of emotional protection, self-reliance, and fear. Each time intimacy becomes real, that protective system becomes active. What looks like rejection from the outside is often an attempt to restore emotional safety from the inside. That is why the same pattern continues repeating. Closeness creates emotional activation. Emotional activation awakens fear. Fear creates distance. Distance temporarily restores a sense of safety. Then connection slowly becomes possible again, only for the cycle to repeat once more. It is not a straight path toward deeper intimacy. It is a repeating loop that returns to emotional distance whenever vulnerability begins feeling too intense. But once you recognize this pattern clearly, something important changes. You stop seeing the behavior as random or impossible to understand. You recognize the emotional structure underneath it. And once you understand the structure, it loses much of its power over your emotions. That is where real clarity begins. It is where healthier decisions become possible. Most importantly, it is where your own emotional growth truly starts. Because understanding another person's patterns should never come at the cost of losing yourself.